Come on, Florence, you've got to give us a little more than that.
No, you. Go on, you don't want me to bore you with it. It's,
Doing it again, Florence. Please.
Tell the anecdote, Florence, or we'll come up there to force it out of you.
We all know you can't do that.
Please, Florence. I'd like to hear it.
Fine, since you ask so smartly, Jamar. Well, my Keith, he used to love the calm that he got from playing his cards. And nowadays, I rarely think about it. Solitaire, I mean, since Keith, well, anyway, it's hard now that the whole world has got to stay shut inside. Keith was the one who dealt with all the technological stuff, which is why this is the first time that I've felt anything, really. And I suppose I've got you to thank for keeping me. Anyway, my story. Oh, blimey. Come on, Florence. So Keith used to say to me, that...
And I'm afraid that's your time, Florence. Oh. If you'd like another half hour, we do offer an extension at the unbeatable price of just $24.99. Less than £1 a minute for the pleasure of our company. Can't quite believe it myself. But we have been nattering away for 90 minutes, so I will have to stop you there. Shame, really, because I really did want to hear what Keith.
Oh.
Keith, yes, what Keith used to say. Really did.
Yes, of course. What, 90 already? No. Yes. Well, do you take...
Florence. We do take bank transfer. We also offer a recording of today's virtual hangout at the low price of £3.99, which, quite frankly, is daylight robbery. What will it be, Florence? Another round with me and Jamal, or will that be all?
Right. Yes. No. Well, you see, I shan't be able to work the recording, and, well, I haven't got that much, so that'll be...
Sorry, Florence, you'll have to speak up. I'm slightly deaf in one ear. Will that be all?
That'll
be all. Right. Well, thank you, Florence, for using Friend to End Limited today. We do hope you've enjoyed our services. We've certainly loved getting to know you. Do get back in touch if isolation gets too much. Payment terms will be with you in a matter of minutes. And once again, thank you and goodbye.
Bye, Mrs. Robin. Wish you all the best.
No, yeah, of course.
I'll bet Kenny went out of his way to catch the virus. I'd rather pop my clogs too if the other choice was being stuck inside with that misery. So, how was your first?
Found it hard.
Not surprised. We would have got more life out of the Grim Reaper himself.
It's Keith, not Ken.
No. No, there's just a lag.
But what if it wasn't? We were talking to her forehead for the first 20 minutes.
I've seen worse on a webcam.
But you're not getting it. What has she heard? She's not stable. She's fragile.
Not our problem, kid. Rule 1, leave your emotions on the call. Don't get connected. That's not our job.
She just lost her husband. She could easily be my mum. And she's all by herself. You do know that. And you just compared her to death. And she hurt.
Tell me I'm wrong.
We're supposed to keep her company.
What do you want me to say, kid? Maybe she did hear. Maybe she didn't. We humoured her for 90 minutes. We're not suddenly responsible for her entire emotional well-being.
But we kind of are, aren't we?
We're light relief, not bloody therapists. She has cash, we have time. It's a good exchange. Do you want to be able to pay for that pitiful excuse for a flat, or do you want to go back home to mummy?
I want to ring her back.
Not an option. You signed a contract. Once she's gone, she's out of your life. The world's bloody scary right now, and we just kept a lonely old woman company from the comfort of our own homes. No risk, and she'll have something to remember when she goes to bed tonight.
But what if she doesn't make it to bed?
Don't ruin a good trial, kid. Leave it. Go and take your mind off it. You did a good thing today. Don't do anything that allows me not to pay you for it, all right?
Fine. It's just...
hard. I know. The first one always is. Chin up, kid. You'll come back fighting.
I'm sending the money now. I'm going as quick as I can. I'm just not very good with... Sorry, just please leave me be.
I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I don't know if you heard Barney. He's a little insensitive. I care about you, Florence, and I kind of wanted to know what Keith used to say.
Look, I don't want your optional extras. I don't have any more.
Look, you're more than just a customer, Florence. I'm sorry. How about me and you just chat? Just me and you, no money.
No, just leave me, please. I'm not worth it.
No, maybe you're right. I shouldn't have called. I just wanted you to know that I hear you.
The outcome is decided not in the course of play, but when the cards are shuffled.
I'm sorry?
The outcome is decided not in the course of play.
Keith.
He was a smart man.
Oh, okay, I see. Very cozy. Florence, I'm terribly sorry if Jamal's bothering you. It's his first day with us, and I can assure you after this it'll be his last. Jamal, log off now. This is entirely against protocol. I can deal with Florence, thank you. I'll speak to you later. You're out of luck, kid.
No, but it was just, she was,
I don't.
Now.
I hear you, Florence.
He's weak. Get rid of him. And you're losing your judgment, Barney. Up your game. Or you're next.